Hello, everyone. This is Rick from the OWASP Sydney chapter. Thank you very much for coming. I just wanted to say thank you very much for the support you guys have shown throughout the year. It's been really good. I know it's been a difficult year with people being in lockdown and the whole thing. I know everyone says the same, but we all experience the lockdown in different ways. And I think it's been challenging. It's good that we have all these webinars available, but yeah, you win some, you lose some. So yeah, just 1 second. So yeah, today we have a very special presentation. We got my good friend Abhijeth coming over. He's the application security manager, I believe, big commerce. He has a ton of experience in application security. He, I don't know, he's like the master of application security. Every time he comes, he puts these fantastic presentations. Today, he's going to talk about application security, how to multiply our very dwindling resources. So yeah, thank you very much for coming, Avi. As usual, I'm always looking forward to a fantastic presentation from you. So floor is yours. Thanks, man.
Awesome. Thanks, Rick. And you mentioned a very interesting point. I think it's been a really tough year for all of us in different perspectives. I know people in cybersecurity have been like busier than ever. I feel like this year we have gone through more security incidents or like different kinds of security vulnerabilities than ever before. And with everyone working from home, suddenly, I think it was last year, but still like the whole work from home culture has definitely put us into like new challenges that we all started adapting and trying to find answers. And obviously, I started with this meme because by this point, if you're working in information security, you would have heard of what Log4j is. If not, please go and research about Log4j. And if you work in a large enterprise, and you haven't spent your weekend, today is Tuesday currently in Sydney, Australia. So if you haven't spent the weekend or if you haven't spent Monday and Tuesday researching about this vulnerability, there is a high chance you're already vulnerable to it and you don't know that you're vulnerable to it. So please go and do some research. I don't know. I don't know if InfoSec will have something like a holiday season, but I think it'll be fantastic if we all can get some rest. My name is Abhijeth Dugginapeddi. Today, I will be talking about application security scaling and security champions, and I'll talk about some of the most common challenges that various application security teams face and why it's actually a little bit of a problem right now when it comes to various application security practices and why scaling can be a problem. And the other topic that I would be discussing in today's presentation is in almost the entirety of today's presentation, the various softwares or various tools or various approaches that we talk about would be aimed towards going towards zero cost or an almost zero cost. What I mean to say is like, I will share some of my experiences in working with various products or various open source tools that are available on the internet that can almost do the job for you. And yeah, by no means throughout the presentation when I'm talking about open source softwares, I'm not trying to underestimate any security vendors. I feel like there are some amazing security vendors in our industry who do a lot of things that we as humans cannot do, but it's more about how we can amplify or how we can multiply the work that we are doing by using these various open source softwares. You would have seen some of my introduction. I manage a small application security team at BigCommerce. BigCommerce is an open SaaS platform, so we allow people to create their own e-commerce websites, and my job is to secure these e-commerce websites. So I have to have this pleasure of working with some really smart developers, which makes my job interesting. I also still teach at UNSW. It's been 5 years now, and that is something I enjoy. And I also mentor a small security startup called Strobes, which does security orchestration and a bunch of those things. And moral of the story is like, I basically enjoy what I do. And that's why I like talking about application security. I just enjoy what I do for work. This is one slide I generally like to have in almost all of my presentations. Nobody is responsible for what I speak. It's mostly me. These are my thoughts and my opinions, and my experiences might be different to yours. If we disagree, let's agree to disagree and let's have a conversation. And I'm always open to learn if I say something wrong in the next few minutes. Going back to, I think in one of my previous presentations at OWASP, we talked about modern web architecture, which is very hard to define because we have multiple components talking to each other, and we have multiple services, we have multiple data warehouses, etc. Now, the problem that we as application security teams face with complex architectures is like there are so many changes that go on the internet on a regular basis. And with so many changes going on the internet, it is actually very hard for us as application security engineers to keep a track of everything, right? Because, for example, back in the day when things were more waterfall style, we as penetration testers or security engineers used to come in the testing phase just before something goes live. We would come and say, hey, this is vulnerable and this is not vulnerable, or these are the vulnerabilities, and we would allow projects to go live, or we would disallow projects to go live, or we provide various security recommendations. But with agile practices, it's actually really hard to follow that old waterfall-based models because those old models no longer work. And these are some statistics I took from GitHub. What GitHub does is like every year they do something called as GitHub Octoverse, and they release these numbers on the internet. And some of these numbers are absolutely mind-blowing, right? Like from October 2019 to September 2020, there have been 1.9 billion plus contributions on GitHub. 1.9 plus billion. Now, as a security person, if I'm thinking about those 1.9 billion various contributions, how many of them do you think would have gone through some form of security review? If you're taking an educated guess, maybe 10%, maybe 20%. Okay, let's take 30%, right? Like even 30% of 1.9 billion is like 500 million or like half a billion. There is still like 1.5 billion contributions that wouldn't have gone through any security review. And that, as a security person, is concerning. And this is why I go back to tackling the problem of why application security is like so hard to scale, because sometimes we as human beings are just having a human looking at all the different types of code changes and doing a security review is almost not possible. And these are some other numbers I got, right? Like again, octoverse.github.com. You go there, you'll find this report, and you'll actually see that 17% of the vulnerabilities were explicitly malicious, but triggered using 0.2% of the alerts. And these numbers are again extremely fascinating. You can see how like 17% of all the vulnerabilities were explicitly malicious, and they have been triggered just by using 0.2%. And these numbers kind of put perspective in your head. And if you do some statistics, you actually try to understand that the scale of the problems that we are all dealing with is huge. And I know at this point you must be thinking, oh, Abhijeth, I'm just a small organization, or I'm an organization who doesn't make 1.9 billion changes, or I'm an organization who only makes changes to production maybe once or twice a day. Now think about this, right? If you're writing code, how much of the code are you writing from scratch? And how many dependencies that you use in your code that are written by someone else? Or how many open source softwares that you're using that are written by someone else? Or what are the programming languages? What are the frameworks you're using? Or what are different components that you're using in your organization that are actually not written by you, right? And if you think about all those things, suddenly it's not those one or two changes that you as an engineering team is making per day, but it's also indirectly about all the code contributions that you have been using as a part of open source or a third-party vendor or some magical coding framework also contributes towards your code, and if any of them are vulnerable or if any of them have a vulnerability, they kind of tie back to your application, and suddenly there might be a vulnerability in your application, right? And that's why it's important for us to keep a perspective of what's happening out there. And that's why, as an application security engineer, suddenly your problem is not just the code that is written internally, but it's also about what are the external packages or what are the external code that is implemented in your organization or as a part of your code base. And at this point, I'll take a break and I'll ask you this question that you can think in your head. Let's say if you're an application security team, how many of you actually know or have an inventory of all the different dependencies that you're using in your current organization, all the different technologies that you're using in your current organization, and how many of you actually have a tier-wise classification of these dependencies or these software packages or these frameworks that you're using in your organization? If you don't have an answer right now, maybe that's a good place for you to start as a company, or maybe that's a good place for you to start as a team. Because if you don't know what are the libraries that you're using in your organization, or if you don't know what are the dependencies that you're using in your organization, how can you go and check if there is a vulnerability that comes out just as similar as like Log4j? Like, for example, the other day, Log4j was released, right? If you're a company who has an inventory or who has an almost up-to-date inventory of all the different packages and libraries and softwares that you're using, it actually becomes slightly easier for you to go and see whether any of these packages are using an existing vulnerability or an existing version and try to update them. But if you as an application security don't have that, then it just makes it really hard. Then you as an application security team or an incident management team are going through all the softwares one after another. And incident management or incident response actually becomes harder by not having not so great application security team practices. So again, that was a question I wanted all of you who are watching this video to ask yourselves, and that is generally a great place for any security team to start. And when we're talking about information security, there are multiple teams that do various kinds of roles and responsibilities. I'm not going to dive deep into all of these components, but if you're a part of an information security or a cybersecurity team which does multiple components, sometimes being able to define what these teams do is also important. But at the same time, how much tie-up do you have between all of the other information security teams kind of goes back to scaling. Like, for example, are your red teams and blue teams coordinating together? Do you ever do a red team, blue team engagement where a red team is actually attacking at something and the blue team is sitting there and trying to defend against whatever attacks you're doing? If not, maybe you would want to start looking at an yearly exercise where you start trying to do an exercise like this and try to see how much vulnerabilities that the red team can do and how much the blue team can actually defend. And I call the journey of application security maturity, I try to compare it with like a human evolution. And unfortunately or fortunately, there is no best security team or there is no best way of doing security. What I mean to say is, like, from my experiences, there have been security teams who work as a vertical, have no collaboration or no direct relation with the engineering teams and still do really well. At the same time, I've worked in security teams who collaborate really closely with the engineering teams and work as product security engineers, or every engineering team has an application security person and they kind of go back to the security team, etc. And there are different organization structures, and it is very hard to define which one's right. So you as an engineer, you as a company needs to start thinking about what is the right organization structure. And based on the right organization structure, you can start looking at how you can become more security mature, right? Like at this point, again, during the talk, it's a good point for you to see which bucket do you fall under. Are you still building and establishing security? If you are, then maybe those are the things that you would like to do. If you're already a security aware company, you would have some form of governance, you would have some form of security in SDLC, you would already have some labs, you would already have some security protection, and various risk-based approaches all implemented to call yourself as a company that is security aware. So to be able to tackle this whole scaling problem, you kind of want to see which bucket do you fit in, and based on the bucket that you fit in, you might want to look at the next stages or how you can go to the next step. And to be able to do that, the three main components that I think are important, again, if you look at OWASP AppSec guide, or if you look at any framework like NIST, you would see that these are the three major components, like tooling, training, and processes. Maybe they might be using different names, but the bottom line of any scaling, any application security scaling problem could be tackled by tooling, training, and processes. And I think I mentioned risk-based approach to security. And I think this is, again, if you are still a company who doesn't have a mature security team, these are the questions that you would want to ask. Like, what are we protecting? I mean, if you are a mobile application, you should be more worried about the vulnerabilities that are applicable to your mobile application rather than thinking about whether NASA has invested $1 million to find an Apple exploit. Like, that's, sorry, not NASA, NSA. That's really not a problem that you should be worried about, right? Because if NSA is investing $1 million to find an Apple exploit, good for them. That means most of the applications who are installed on Apple might be able to be exploited. Whereas you as an application, your problem is to be, you as an application on Apple Store, your problem is to think about all the different vulnerabilities that are applicable to your application, not necessarily what someone else is doing. So it's more about understanding what are we protecting and what are the attackers can do from their budget. Like, for example, if I'm a script kiddie and I don't have a lot of resources, how much time do I have to spend on your application to find my first vulnerability? Like, if I'm finding a vulnerability in like 10 to 15 minutes, then maybe my app is not that secure. But if I'm a script kiddie and I'm coming with like all these low-hanging fruits, and if I can't find any low-hanging fruit in the first 1 hour, automatically as an attacker or a script kiddie, I'm making an assumption that you're not too bad and I'm moving on to the next target. So these are the questions that you might want to answer in terms of defining what do you want your team goals to be. And then you want to classify as what is the actual risk and what are you protecting against. Now, why DevSecops or application security, right? I think I've said the word application security quite a few times, and DevSecops being the fancy word that we all try to use, and something then as this is a problem that we are all trying to tackle. I think this is definitely a hard ball to tackle. And like I mentioned earlier, there is no right or wrong way to do it, but there is definitely a really bad way to do it. What I mean to say is, like, either I can set myself to fail, or I can set myself to fail less times or less ways than what every other company is doing. But one of the best problems that DevSecops or an application security team solves is you would be able to find vulnerabilities faster than before, and you would be able to find like most of the vulnerabilities or low-hanging fruits by using some form of automation. Now, you must be thinking, why do we even care about low-hanging fruits, right? Like, I'm not encouraging everyone to say, oh, you should be finding low-hanging fruits. But what I'm trying to say is, like, if your automated softwares or tools can start identifying low-hanging fruits that you can fix faster, then your human resources or like your human application security engineers can start thinking about the more important vulnerabilities. Then as an application security engineer, I think I enjoy more identifying a vulnerability when I'm using my human skill, or when I'm using my logic, or when I'm using this really fancy exploit that I have worked for 2 or 3 days, rather than copying and pasting an XSS payload and getting an XSS. This XSS payload that I copy and paste and find is also important, but as a human attacker or like as a human engineer, there is more value if I'm using my human skills to identify those vulnerabilities. So DevSecops concept kind of tackles the problem of identifying as many vulnerabilities as possible quite before something goes into production. And it also makes it slightly easier to deploy safer applications. And I use the word safer applications, not necessarily 100% secure, is that I think at this point, because we all work in security, we understand that there's nothing called as 100% security. Like we all try to get as close to 100% security as possible. And that's why we want to see how many of these components come back and tie together and solve our problem. This is again a small example of a standard SDLC project and how you can use different types of problems that can be solved using different techniques that you would want as a part of your AppSec pipeline. And at this point, by this point, you all would have seen this screenshot either on OWASP or either on some other presentation or somewhere on the internet where we talk about DevSecops and where we talk about all these fancy frameworks and all these fancy operations and processes that you can embed as a part of your DevSecops or AppSec pipeline. But the question is how to do it, right? Like, I think, let's say, for example, you see this diagram and you're like, oh, most of these terms make sense to me. Yeah, I want to have some monitoring, or I want to have some testing, or I want to have a static code analysis tool. But what if I don't have $1 million to do it? Or what if my company is not big enough to have money to do it? Or what if my cybersecurity team doesn't have a lot of budget to do it? Because there are a lot of companies who are still doing cybersecurity or still has a security team, but don't necessarily have the budget. And that's fine and that's fair, right? Because different teams have different budgets. And that's why I want to run through some of the most commonly used open source softwares that you can have as a part of your tooling that will be able to solve most of your automation related problems. But before doing that, this is a question I recently asked on my LinkedIn, and I asked my friends and connections on what's a good security engineer versus developer ratio in your company, and what do you think is ideal? Now, as you can see, it's an even mix between 1:25 and 1:50 and 1:100. If you ask me, the ideal state that any company should be in is maybe around 1:16 or 1:20. Anything more than that, I would not necessarily put them in the security mature bucket. But by looking at this slide, you must be thinking about your organization right now. And if you are in that 1:50 or 1:100 ratio, then maybe that's too much work for an application security engineer. Because if you're one application security engineer, looking at the code that's contributed by 100 engineers, isn't that too much? And that's when things get out of control. And that's when you as a security engineer, you have more than you can chew on your plate. And it is possible for you to miss vulnerabilities. And as security engineers, we hate missing vulnerabilities, right? Like we want to find as many things as we can. But I think one thing I also want to tell as a part of this talk is that it's actually inevitable for us to find everything. In other words, what I want to say is it's almost impossible for us to find everything. Most often than not, we all will miss a vulnerability or two. Unfortunately, that's the nature of our work. Unfortunately, that's how we work. And that's why we try to identify as many vulnerabilities as possible. And for you to be able to do that, a good ratio of security engineers versus developer should be somewhere around 1:25 or 1:20, but not 1:100. Interestingly, when I had this post on my LinkedIn, few people actually commented and said, what about companies that don't even have 1:100? Or what about companies who don't have security engineers at all? That's a bit scary, but I am aware that there are still companies who don't have security engineers or a security team. If there are people who are about how open source is very powerful, and how there are multiple security tools that we can use as a part of the open source software, right? Now, there are different buckets. I have just named some of them here. What I would ideally like you to do is after this talk is finished, please go and research about these tools and try to identify which tool solves your problem. For example, there are some like static code analysis. SAS stands for static code analysis security testing. DAS stands for dynamic application security testing, dynamic analysis.
Sorry,
SEA.
I think we had a problem in the comms.
No worries.
Is it okay to continue now, Jack? Or I don't know. Well, it seems to be back online. So sorry, man. To interrupt you. So let's keep going. It's very interesting so far.
No problem. So I'll quickly go to my previous slide. Basically, what I was saying is open source is very powerful. Irrespective of what the security engineer versus developer ratio is, there is some level of security you can achieve and some level of security that you can achieve by looking at some of these open source softwares and when they are implemented correctly. I have a couple of slides where me and actually I forgot to mention, so these slides are also co-authored by another security person called as Akhil Rainey. I definitely have Fred's and his profile towards the end of this presentation. So you can also feel free to reach out to him. He's also like an application security guru that I like to follow. But when we made these slides, we tried to include as many tools that we trust and that are useful to you. The idea is to not go through all of them, but for you to do research and try to identify which tool or which open source software solves your problem based on the programming language that you use. Like, for example, if you use Ruby on Rails, Brakeman is probably a heaps better SaaS tool when compared to SendGrab. Or let's say, for example, if you're a purely web-based application, OWASP Zap is slightly better for you when compared to maybe Nuclei. But if you're a purely WordPress-based application, then you would want to definitely look at something like WP Scan. What I mean to say is you as a team, based on the technologies that you're using, you might want to identify which of these make more sense to you. And these are some more open source tools on a more cloud or like a Docker specific perspective. For example, if you're looking at cloud monitoring, something like Waza is super powerful, and it will provide you some level of cloud monitoring by which you can look at your traffic and you can start logging, and you can even sometimes block requests and add some rules in Waza. Or for example, if you are someone who is using a lot of infrastructure as code, then you might want to definitely look at something like TF-Lint, and TF-Lint is actually one of my favorite tools that you can customize the way you want to, etc. The reason I'm not going deep into any of these tools is I'm not here to talk about one or two tools specifically, but I'm here more to give you an idea that there are actually enough open source contributions made by a lot of security engineers in every segment of application security that you can think about. The point is, the most important thing that you should be thinking about is how to introduce this tooling. For example, DevOps is already heavy. There is already so much processing happening as a part of DevOps, right? When you make a code contribution, it goes from dev to staging to integration to testing to production. So there are already a lot of checks that are happening before something goes to production. And there are a lot of unit tests, there are a lot of user acceptance test cases, and there is a lot of production tests. I'm hoping you have all these gates and controls in place. If not, maybe that's another thing for you to think about, and that's a whole different problem I won't get into. But because DevOps is already so heavy, if let's say your release process takes 1 hour, and I as a security person and come and say, hey, can we please introduce this security software? And instead of 1 hour, now you're going to take 3 hours. Obviously, your engineering team is not going to listen to you, because if previously it took 1 hour and now it's taking 3 hours and it's taking 3 times more time, then maybe that's not the best approach. So because DevOps is already so heavy, you might want to identify tools which are which are catering to the already existing heavy processes and trying to make sure that you're not adding more load than what you already have. And depending on how big your engineering team is, you might want to actually segregate different tools based on the requirements, based on the repositories, and based on what the team is doing. And one good way to do it is like as a security engineer or as a security team, you can do some proof of concepts on all of these or like most of these open source tools, identify the technologies that you're using, and then come up with a priority based on, okay, this is important for me, this is easy to implement, and this is not DevOps heavy. Or maybe this is a super important tool, but it's very difficult to implement, which means you as an engineer is going to spend more time than what you need to. So maybe it's not required for you to go through that path. And then start training your engineers on how to use those tools, right? Because at the end of the day, you as a security engineer, you can't just be the single point of contact for all of these tools. And let's be honest, at the end of the day, it's not us who write code, it's the engineers who are writing code. So they know more about their code than us. And I think one skill we definitely have is being able to read someone else's code and identify vulnerabilities. I think that's a gift, or that's a skill that most people in security have developed. Now, let us keep that skill to ourselves and let us start training the engineers on how we identify vulnerabilities and how we integrate these tools into a DevOps pipeline to make it DevSecops, so that they can start fixing these issues if it runs into like any issues, or it runs into like any problems or any integration issues. And always do pre-commit checks. Always start with pre-commit checks at least, so that will give feedback to the engineers immediately, and that will also enable you to identify things as soon as possible. And as a security team, please be open for feedback from engineers. Sometimes there is a chance that some security tool is not necessarily solving the problem, and you would always want to think, going back to risk-based approach, risk versus reward scenario, right? Like when you're introducing any of these open source tools, is it actually solving problem? Like, is it actually helping you identify vulnerabilities? Is it actually helping the engineering team identify any vulnerabilities? Or is it just giving you more work by breaking builds or by identifying false positives, etc.? So these are the questions that you would want to ask when you're introducing these tools, and always be ready to get some feedback. One thing I like to do is when I am doing any proof of concept with any of these technologies, I actually like to have someone from engineering as a part of the proof of concept, so that they can give me that engineering perspective, they can give me that developer perspective on how we are trying to solve the problem and how this problem is helping them to find a quick resolution. And once they're more comfortable, start integrating it into CI/CD, because at this point you are still not in CI/CD. Now you're integrating into CI/CD, and now you can start writing those customizations, and these customizations will now start helping you to find less false positives. And then once you're deployed there, then you can start looking about continuous monitoring, because now you're already deployed on CI/CD. You're now identifying vulnerabilities. You can start running cron jobs on a regular basis, and now you can start thinking about implementing something like WASP, where you're actually logging and monitoring these changes, so that, let's say, if one of your security checks identifies a cross-site scripting, even if for some reason it's not shown on your CI/CD, WASP, which is sitting there and logging all these changes, is like saying, hey, I think one of your tools identified ran the script, and the script worked, and here is a log to all those tests that you ran. So having this closed loop approach will help you to start getting more matured. And remember the picture that I showed you, where you're building and you're security aware, and you would want to get to as matured as possible. And vulnerability management is obviously one of the hardest problems that needs to be tackled by an application security team. So have a strong vulnerability management policy. There are also some free vulnerability management software, open source vulnerability management softwares that are available for you if like you can't have like an enterprise tool. So again, open sourcing is actually really vulnerable, and at this moment, I really want to take a minute and thank all the security researchers who have contributed and given us all these open source softwares. I think it's absolutely fantastic how our community is so open and helps. Like, we believe in the concept of sharing is caring, and like so many engineers have written these tools to help each other. And here we are as a part of this AppSec community trying to share knowledge among each others. And this is again a very sample DevSecops process. This is just an idea on how your company's process might want to look like. Now let's get to the security champion point, right? Because I know I've been talking about all of these stuff, and I've said like take the help of engineers, include them as a part of proof of concept. Now the question is, why would someone want to do it? Like, why would an engineer want to help a security person? Or why would they want to work with security people, right? And that's where establishing something like a security champion program is absolutely amazing, because you're actually closing the gap between engineers and security people. Because the closer the gap between engineers and security people, or product and security people, the faster you can find vulnerabilities, and the better are the vulnerabilities that you find. Like, for example, in my current company or in my previous company or even the company before that, I have had several experiences where the developers have identified vulnerabilities even before a security engineer gets to it. Now, I know as a security person, I might, if I'm scared of it, I might be like, oh my god, like if a developer is identifying a vulnerability, what about my job? Or what about like, if I stop identifying vulnerabilities, will I lose my job, or is it a threat to my current team? The answer is no, right? Because look at it this way. If you have enabled the developer to identify vulnerability by themselves, it means you have already trained the security culture that is needed. And by a developer starting to think like a security person, they will start writing secure code, which means your job will become more interesting. Suddenly, you're not looking at the boring copy and paste vulnerabilities, but you start looking at different ways to identify vulnerabilities, or you start looking at different ways to protect your applications. And I think as security engineers or people working in security industry, we all love a challenge or two, or we all love to be pushed sometimes to identify better vulnerabilities or chain multiple vulnerabilities or come up with this proof of concept which we have never seen before. So as a part of it, as a part of building that security culture, security champion program is absolutely amazing, right? And one of the best ways you can do it is start identifying one security champion for at least like 7 to 10 engineers as a starting point. And then what you can start doing is like you can start giving them regular training. Rick knows this. One of the things that we tried in my previous company while working with Rick was we actually started with the CTF. We gave them no training. We had, I think we took OWASP Juice Shop, put it on an AWS box, gave them a link, and then gave them 2 weeks. And then we were like, go find vulnerabilities. It was such a big success that the developers actually were fighting against each other to find vulnerabilities. And a couple of them even spent time over the weekend. And this has not just happened in my current company, but the same thing also happened in my previous company when we launched a security champion program. And you'd be surprised to see how much the developers are actually interested in finding security vulnerabilities. It's just that unfortunately, they don't have enough time. And the security champion program is an avenue by which you as a security team are trying to improve the culture and also allowing them to explore their security passion. And you can establish the program in such a way that there's only one engineer for 7 to 8 engineers who's doing security related work. And maybe they're only spending 1 hour every week, right? Like you can start with as basic as 1 hour every week. But soon you will start realizing that the 1 hour that one security engineer in an engineering team is spending has 10 times more benefit, because suddenly this person is a security representative in their daily stand-up. So if I am an engineer and I throw an idea, there doesn't have to be a security engineer, but the security champion is trying to think like an attacker and come up with attack scenarios to actually do something like a simple threat model in a daily stand-up. to think about vulnerabilities that normally the engineering team won't be thinking about. So just by teaching them some vulnerabilities, just by giving them some training, the benefits are actually magnified. Identify the right tools. Again, going back to the concept of open source tooling, maybe there's one engineer who's good with source code. There might be another engineer who's good with like dependencies and libraries. Maybe there's a platform level engineer. Maybe there's an engineer who's interested in Docker. So depending on who is the engineer and what is the skill set and what are the what do they bring to the table, try to identify the right tool and make them the champion of that tool so that they can start taking some more ownership, and they start taking slightly more accountability. Now, again, why do we have to do it? I think I've covered most of it. You have better code coverage. Like I told you, if you're a company where your ratio is 1:50 or 1:100, there is absolutely no way you can go through all the pull requests. There is no chance one engineer can go through all the pull requests submitted by hundreds of engineers. At least by having security champions, when they are doing code reviews, they will start thinking about security. And at least if they find something dodgy or something not right, they will include you, and then you can start looking at those code bases. And then because the security champion told you, hey, Abhi, I think there is a vulnerability here, you'd go there and research, and your life becomes much more easier because someone has already pointed you towards a vulnerability. And at that point, you only have to use your skills and knowledge to find vulnerability. There are some challenges, though. I'm not going to say that this is going to be a very easy program to implement in your organization. One of the biggest challenges is sometimes you'll find some engineers who are, for lack of a better phrase, overly passionate about security. And maybe they might be spending like 10 to 15 hours in a week just identifying security vulnerabilities, which is good. But also, if at the end of the day, an engineer's job is to write code, and if they're spending more time on security than what they need to, then maybe it's not necessarily defeating the purpose. Or in other hands, maybe that person needs to join the application security team, and maybe the application security manager starts to think about, hey, do you want to join the security team because you're actually enjoying what you're doing? So you need to be very clear about what their roles and responsibilities are. And I think the AppSec team members need to understand that like these security champions are your extended team members. So we should not be afraid to teach them more techniques or teach them how to find vulnerabilities, and not think that these people are your competitors or they're trying to affect your job, but they're actually your extended team members. So having those roles and responsibilities and having that expectation set for the application security champions helps. And another challenge that I've noticed is, and again, this has happened in both my current company and my previous company, is like to keep the interest going, because it's all new and exciting in the beginning, but after 1 year, because they still have to deliver their regular roles and responsibilities, it becomes harder to keep the interest going. One of the best suggestions I like to give is have a rotation model for your security champions. Like the security champions that you find right now, maybe try to change them after 6 months. After 6 months, have like a different security champion in the same engineering team. So this way, in about 2 years, you have 4 people in the team, in an 8-member team, who have been security champion at least for 6 months. So almost everyone in the team is starting to get more security mature, which means you as a security engineer, your job is starting to, like your job is, you can see more dividends. And at this point, I also want to mention, if you are an application security team, and if your success is only being measured by the number of vulnerabilities that are identified, I think you should start thinking about how you're measuring your success again. Because all the vulnerabilities that you're actually blocking from going to production is also a big win. If you as an application security engineer do threat modeling, do automation, train your engineers, and when you're doing a pen test, if you don't find any security vulnerabilities, I think sometimes we all need to pat our back, because all the training that we have done to help an engineer to write secure code is actually working out. And that's why your job has become harder. So I'm sorry for the slight segue, but this is more a philosophical thing that I wanted to share with most application security teams. And If your managers or your bosses are just counting the number of vulnerabilities, so please start going back and telling them it's not just the number of vulnerabilities that measures an application security team success, but sometimes when you're not finding vulnerabilities, it means your engineers are doing a good job, which means all the education and training that you as a security team is doing is actually working. There is a security champion playbook too. Again, thanks to all these open source contributors. This is the link to the playbook. There's also an OWASP playbook. I would highly recommend to go and start looking at it. Again, you want to take components that are applicable to you. Not necessarily don't, because someone has written a playbook, don't just try to copy and paste it and do everything that is mentioned in this slide pack. Try to take things that are applicable to you and your team and your company. And then that's when I feel like you can implement the program in a much more better. Security training, as I mentioned, is a huge part of any security team. Irrespective, not just application security, any security team, security training is a huge part. There are various security platforms. There are open source softwares too. This is a screenshot of Secure Code Warrior. Secure Code Warrior being an Australian company, I feel it's my pleasure to promote them or talk about them. I think they are absolutely amazing when it comes to training people on how to write secure code. You should definitely check them out, and I would highly recommend you to have a look at them. Now that I have ranted for about 40 to 45 minutes, what is the moral of the story, right? So for you to be able to solve, or for you to be able to scale properly with a low cost budget for an application security team, what you need to do is, as a company, you would want to list down the goals of your security team. What do you want to achieve? What are your next 1-year targets, 2-year targets, and 5-year targets for your application security team? Don't try to just copy and paste some framework that is given by a famous company because it has worked for them. Because some framework has worked for one company doesn't mean the exact framework will work for you. Try to identify what are the pieces that will work for your company and your organization, and then try to use those pieces and try to, I think that's a very, you might be thinking, why is Abhijeth sharing such a simple thing? Like, we all know it. I think we all know it, but it's nice to reiterate again and again that we just don't want to copy and paste a framework, but we want to adapt to our company and our company goals. Identify the right problem statements. Don't jump on the bandwagon just because someone has spent $100,000 for a fancy, I don't know, SAST or DAST tool. Doesn't mean you need it. It depends on what you're using. It depends on what security vendor is right for you. Again, don't get me wrong, just because I'm talking about open source softwares doesn't mean I don't like security vendors. I personally use some security vendors in my company, and my previous company, there are some security vendors who do absolutely amazing job. Like, for example, if you're talking about SCA, I still think Sneak is right up there in terms of what they do and the documentation and how much knowledge that they share with everyone. They're right up there. If you're talking about bug bounty programs, we have people like Bugcrowd, HackerOne, or Synac who do an absolutely amazing job. Again, these are some security vendors who bring something different to your table, and it doesn't make any sense in you doing things on your own, right? And if you're a company who still does waterfall, good on you, right? Like, happy days. There is nothing wrong in you doing waterfall. Like, if you're building rockets and if you're building missiles, I don't think agile is for you. Like, I actually hope if you're building airplanes, I'm hoping that you don't follow agile. But if you actually follow a waterfall model. So if you're working in a company and if you're still following waterfall, things are slightly easier for you, and maybe scaling is not necessarily a big problem for you because you actually have a phase called testing and security has enough time for it. But if you're following agile and if you have scaling as a problem, then maybe the things that I've discussed in the last 40-45 minutes might be a little bit useful to you. As I mentioned in the abstract, this is not necessarily a strong technical talk, but it's more on processes. It's more on what works and how you can adapt various things. And again, there might be some things that have said that might not work for you. But again, this is just for us to have a follow-up conversation and start talking about various practices, etc. And these are some resources that I wanted to share with you. Resources There are plenty of other resources, but these are some good starting points if you don't have an application security team or if you don't have a mature security team. As I mentioned earlier, I would really love to thank Akhil Reni, who has actually contributed for half of these slides, and we presented something similar at somewhere else before, but I thought I also want to share this knowledge as a part of OWASP AppSec Sydney and then share this content. And I really hope you all have good holidays. This has been a really tough year, so I hope everyone gets a break and we don't have a lot of security incidents and we actually get time to like spend away from our laptops and keyboards and monitors and phones. And yes, as usual, thanks to all those meme and GIF lords who have shared funny content on that I've used on my slides and all the tools and all the creators. Thanks a lot. If you want to chat, these are my Twitter and LinkedIn. My current company is hiring in both the United States and Australia. We recently filled a position in Australia, but there's another position too. So if you're doing application security and if you're interested about what I've talked in the last few minutes, please feel free to reach out to me. And I think it is a good time for us to talk about any questions.
All right. Thank you very much for that, Avi. I worked with Avi before, and I will recommend him. He's a nice guy to work with, and he's a fountain of knowledge. I think that I am the application security person I am thanks to what I learned from him. He's really good. I'm very humble too. So it's been yeah. So yeah. Anyway, even though we're breaking rule number 1, no promoting anything, but that's okay. That's okay. I'll give you that one. Let's go to question, guys. Hey guys, if you want, come down to Discord. We all here. You can chat with Avi, myself, and Jack. We will take some questions here in the chat for the next minute or two, but then we're gonna close the YouTube and just go to Discord. So join us, please. And yeah, so let's see. I don't know if you can see the Discord. Was some comments from some of your questions. I'm sorry, I'm not gonna pronounce this right, but Chica said, Chica, I don't know. All should have mindsets of security engineer. And then developer Steve replied, yep. So that I'm also trying to work out how to get around my own code. Then he added new methods and attack vectors are always appearing too. Chica replied to, there is quite a bit of overlap, security mindset, quality mindset. Oh, yes. So Jay Chuck, I assume that's a nickname or a username. I like to see a full list of references to external tools and products mentioned this episode. And if that would be possible, Avi, we could perhaps get all the presentation, make it available on the website with the list. Maybe put them in the comments. That would be good.
I will share the link to the slide pack, and that will give everyone access to all the links and stuff.
Fantastic. Okay, so Jack, if you could put the link again on the chat so that people know. I don't see any questions, but please join us on Discord. We always have a nice chat in which we can do a little bit of chatting house rules and get a little bit crazy about these discussions. It's always get a bit interesting. So, join us in Discord. There is the link again. Okay. I don't see any more questions. So, Jack, over to you. Yeah, well, let's thank you guys for coming. Thank you for all the support throughout the year. And join us in Discord so we can continue talking for a little while and get a little bit more into the application security discussion. Thank you very much. And yeah, this is the last presentation for the year. we'll come back with but it's gonna be called Fight Club in January. It's fun. We hack the box, but with an objective. We want to form a kick-ass CTF team, so we start winning some hack the box championships and stuff, and get some pro hackers out of this. So yeah, so even if you're a noob or whatever, you can join, but you gotta show up, right? And then you can train up and join the team, and we can get some prizes home, I guess, some medals or stickers or whatever it is you get. Anyway, thank you very much. See you in Discord.